When my son and his wife decided to renovate their basement into a luxury home theater, rather than honor their promise to provide me a place to live after selling my home on their advice, I didn't create a family scene or beg for reconsideration. Instead, I silently withdrew my life savings they didn't know about, purchased the foreclosed property next door to their upscale suburban home, and established a vibrant senior community center that not only solved my housing needs but brought music, laughter, and 50 new friends to their previously quiet cul-de-sac, teaching them that dismissing a retired urban planner with 4 decades of community development experience was perhaps the most short-sighted decision they could have made. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Eleanor Winters, and at 73 years old, I've learned that sometimes life's greatest chapters can begin precisely when others assume your story is ending. I spent 42 years working for the Millfield Urban Development Authority, eventually becoming the Director of Community Planning, where I oversaw the revitalization of once-neglected neighborhoods into thriving, interconnected communities, with mixed-use spaces that brought people together rather than isolating them. The modest brick colonial house on Maple Street where I'd lived for 35 years wasn't just a home. It was the physical manifestation of the community planning principles I'd dedicated my career to promoting. The wraparound porch where neighbors gathered for my legendary Sunday afternoon teas, the community garden I'd established in the side yard that fed 5 families besides my own, the converted garage that had become a neighborhood library, and children's reading room. Every inch of that property represented my belief that spaces should foster connection rather than isolation. I'd purchased the house as a young widow with a 5-year-old son, James, after my husband Robert's sudden passing from an undiagnosed heart condition. In those early days, living on a junior planner's salary while paying for childcare had been challenging, but the house had been within reach thanks to its location, in what was then considered an transitional neighborhood. Many of my colleagues questioned my decision to invest in an area that city officials had largely written off, but I saw potential where others saw problems. "Eleanor, you're being idealistic," my department head had warned when I announced my home purchase. "That neighborhood needs commercial redevelopment, not more residential investment." The crime statistics alone should give you pause, especially with a young child. But I had recognized what many of my professionally trained colleagues often missed, that authentic communities are built by residents with genuine investment in shared spaces, not by developers imposing external visions. Over the decades that followed, I worked alongside neighbors to transform our transitional area into one of the most desirable mixed-income communities in Millfield, with thriving local businesses, active community spaces, and a strong sense of shared identity that transcended socioeconomic differences. James grew up benefiting from this tight-knit community, being mentored by Mr. Patterson, the retired high school principal next door, learning to cook from Mrs. Abramowitz, who ran the local bakery, and developing his early interest in technology through weekend workshops at the community center that my planning team had helped establish. The neighborhood became his extended family, providing the rich social environment that helped shape him into the accomplished but ambitious young man who eventually left for college and never truly returned, except for obligatory holiday visits. As James established his career in software development and married Diana, a marketing executive with impeccable taste and well-connected family, the distance between our lives grew increasingly pronounced. Their suburban 5-bedroom home in Lakeside Estates, with its manicured lawn and restricted covenants, represented values diametrically opposed to the community-centered principles that had guided my life's work. While I took pride in James's professional success, I often wondered if the communal values I had tried to instill had been completely overshadowed by the individualistic achievement culture his wife's family so strongly embraced. "Mom, I don't understand why you insist on staying in that neighborhood when you could afford something much nicer now," James would comment during his increasingly infrequent visits. "The property values have tripled since you bought it, You could cash out and get a beautiful condo in a modern building with security and amenities. This house isn't an investment property, James, I would explain patiently. It's the center of a community network that's taken decades to build. Mrs. Rodriguez depends on my garden to supplement her grandchildren's diets. The neighborhood children need the reading room for after-school programs. Mr. Chen and I maintain the emergency preparedness supplies for the entire block. Diana would invariably exchange knowing glances with James during these conversations, clearly categorizing my community commitments as eccentric attachments rather than purposeful social infrastructure. Eleanor, she would say, using my first name, despite my gentle corrections early in our relationship. At your age, you should be thinking about convenience and security, not neighborhood responsibilities. It's time to let the younger generation take over those concerns. These subtle pressures to downsize appropriately increased after my retirement 3 years ago, though I remained actively engaged as a community planning consultant and neighborhood association president. Each family dinner seemed to include some reference to a friend's parent who had made the sensible choice to move into an age-restricted community or luxury condominium, always presented as cautionary examples of the freedom and security I was denying myself through stubborn attachment to an outdated living situation. What changed the dynamic completely was the unexpected inspection notice I received from the city's building safety department 16 months ago. A newly appointed inspector, coincidentally a former college classmate of Diana's brother, had flagged my converted garage library and reading room as unpermitted structural modifications, requiring expensive updates to meet current commercial codes, despite the space having operated without incident for over 20 years, with the full knowledge of previous inspectors. This is clearly targeted enforcement, argued my neighbor Marcus Williams, who had served as a city attorney before his retirement. They've never applied commercial standards to neighborhood-based resource-sharing spaces before. Someone's putting pressure on the department to find violations. Though Marcus helped me file an appeal, the timing couldn't have been worse. The pandemic had depleted my modest savings through emergency support to neighbors facing unemployment, and the estimate for required modifications totaled nearly $45,000, money I simply didn't have available without liquidating retirement investments. That provided my basic living expenses. During this period of significant stress, James and Diana's suggestion that I sell the house and move in with them temporarily, while finding a more suitable senior living arrangement, began to seem like my only viable option. After several emotional community meetings where neighbors offered partial financial assistance that would still fall far short of the required amount, I reluctantly agreed to consider James's proposal. "We have plenty of space, Mom," James assured me during a video call, his tone conveying the benevolent generosity of someone extending charity rather than filial support. "The basement is completely finished, and we could easily convert it into a comfortable apartment for you. You'd have your own entrance and bathroom, and we could renovate to accommodate any accessibility needs as they arise." Diana nodded encouragingly beside him. "We've been meaning to create a proper in-law suite anyway, and this gives us the perfect opportunity to design something really special. You could help us with the grandchildren after school, and we'd know you were safe and well cared for." The arrangement, while not ideal, seemed to offer a reasonable transition solution. The house sold remarkably quickly, purchased by a development company specializing in neighborhood renewal for significantly above asking price, raising questions I chose not to examine too closely given my limited options. With the sale proceeds securing my financial future but not yet providing alternative housing, I packed my essential belongings, said heartbreaking goodbyes to neighbors who had become family, and drove the 3 hours to James and Diana's Lakeside estate's home with mixed emotions about this new chapter. My first indication that the promised in-law suite might not materialize as described came upon my arrival, when Diana directed me to the guest bedroom on the main floor, rather than the basement area that had been prominently featured in our discussions. "We thought you'd be more comfortable here temporarily," she explained smoothly. The basement renovation. Needs some additional planning before we begin construction, and this way you won't have to deal with the noise and disruption when work starts. Days in the guest room extended to weeks, and inquiries about the basement plans were met with increasingly vague responses about contractor delays and permit complications. Meanwhile, my carefully packed belongings remained largely in storage, with only seasonal clothing and absolute essentials available in the limited guest room closet space. The household dynamic established itself with uncomfortable clarity over those initial weeks. Though never explicitly stated, the operational assumptions became evident through 1,000 small interactions. I was a guest rather than family member, expected to adapt to established routines rather than contribute to household decisions. My decades of professional experience held no relevance within their social context, and my presence was tolerated primarily for what assistance I might provide with housekeeping and childcare, rather than valued for relationship itself. "Grandmother can pick you up from school today," Diana would inform her children without consulting my schedule or preferences. "I have an important client meeting, and grandmother doesn't have any commitments." The fact that I had arranged a video consultation with a neighborhood association in Millfield that afternoon was considered automatically reschedulable, despite it representing paid consulting work I had committed to before arriving. These assumptions about the disposability of my time and professional obligations accumulated into a clear hierarchy of valued activities within the household structure. The definitive revelation about the basement's true intended purpose occurred approximately 6 weeks after my arrival, when I overheard Diana speaking with a contractor in the kitchen while James was traveling for work. "We're thinking a proper home theater setup," she was explaining, gesturing enthusiastically at design plans spread across the counter. Soundproofed walls, tiered seating for 12, integrated smart home controls for lighting and temperature. James has always wanted a dedicated entertainment space, and with his promotion we can finally make it happen. When she noticed me standing in the doorway, Diana's expression flickered briefly with something resembling guilt, before smoothly transitioning to her standard pleasant efficiency. "Eleanor, I was just discussing some alternative ideas for the basement while we wait for the in-law suite permits. Nothing definite yet, of course." The contractor's confused glance between us confirmed what I already knew. There had never been permit applications for an in-law suite, no plans submitted for the promised accessible bathroom, no intentions whatsoever to create the living space that had been the foundational premise of selling my home. The basement had always been destined to become an entertainment showcase for James's colleagues and Diana's social circle, with my residence in their home a temporary inconvenience rather than the supportive family arrangement that had been portrayed. That evening, when James called from his business trip, I addressed the situation directly but calmly. "I understand there seems to be some confusion about the basement plans," I began, keeping my tone neutral despite the profound disappointment I felt. "Diana is working with contractors on a home theater design, but I was under the impression that space was intended for my apartment." The uncomfortable silence before James responded told me everything I needed to know, even before his carefully worded explanation began. "Mom, we've been thinking about this situation more practically," he said, his voice taking on the slightly patronizing tone I'd come to recognize when he believed he was making superior decisions on my behalf. "The basement renovation for a fully accessible apartment would cost nearly as much as a year in a quality senior living community, which ultimately makes more sense for everyone." "A senior living community wasn't our agreement," I reminded him, maintaining composure despite the rising sense of betrayal. "I sold my home based on the understanding that I would have independent living space in your house." "I know that was the initial plan," James acknowledged without actually accepting responsibility for the change. "But as we looked into the logistics, it became clear that professional senior care would be more appropriate as your needs increase. The proceeds from your house sale should easily cover a nice facility with activities and healthcare support." The subtext was unmistakable. My presence in their home had been recategorized from family commitment to logistical burden, with my housing security now relegated to institutional settings rather than the promised family solution. More painfully, the decision had been made without consultation, presented as finalized strategy rather than family discussion. "I see," I said finally, when it became clear James expected grateful acceptance rather than legitimate objection. "And when were you planning to inform me of this revised arrangement?" His slight hesitation revealed discomfort with being directly confronted about the deception. "We were researching options to present to you. Diana has tours scheduled at 3 facilities next week that she thinks you'll really like. One even has gardening programs that reminded us of your neighborhood projects. The carefully planned nature of this redirection, complete with token acknowledgments of my interest to soften the fundamental breach of promise, demonstrated how thoroughly they had convinced themselves that institutional placement represented appropriate filial responsibility rather than convenient removal of an increasingly inconvenient parent." After ending the call with non-committal responses to James's increasingly defensive justifications, I sat in the impersonal guest room that had never been intended as more than temporary accommodation, considering my options with the strategic assessment that had guided my professional planning career. Rather than reacting from hurt or betrayal, I began analyzing the situation as I would a community development challenge, identifying resources, constraints, and potential partnerships that might create unexpected solutions. The following morning, declining Diana's offer to accompany her on errands with deliberately vague references to not feeling well, I walked the meticulously planned streets of Lakeside Estates for the first time since arriving. Unlike the organic neighborhood evolution I had championed throughout my career, this development embodied the opposite philosophy: rigid uniformity, minimal shared spaces, and design elements specifically intended to minimize unexpected community interactions in favor of privacy and exclusivity. As I walked, I noticed a property that had intrigued me during the drive to James and Diana's house 6 weeks earlier, a large Victorian home at the entrance to their cul-de-sac that appeared vacant, with obvious signs of deferred maintenance despite its prominent location. A faded foreclosure sign tilted in the overgrown front yard, partially hidden by untrimmed shrubs that violated the homeowners association standards so prominently featured in the community welcome packet Diana had presented upon my arrival. The house's placement was strategically significant, directly visible from James and Diana's front windows, positioned at the only entrance to their 6-home cul-de-sac, and substantially larger than the surrounding properties despite its currently neglected condition. My urban planner's eye immediately recognized both its challenges and extraordinary potential, as I made mental notes of the property's features while continuing my seemingly casual neighborhood exploration. That afternoon, while Diana supervised the children's extracurricular activities, I made 2 important phone calls that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of what James and Diana had assumed would be my quiet transition into institutional invisibility. The first was to Marcus Williams, my neighbor and retired city attorney, who had helped manage the sale of my house and currently held the proceeds in an escrow account pending my permanent housing arrangements. "The property is bank-owned following a complicated foreclosure," Marcus confirmed after researching the Victorian house I'd described. "Former owner was a developer who overextended during the market downturn. Asking price is significantly below market value because of condition, issues, and the bank's desire for quick liquidation." My second call was to Sofia Menendez, my former deputy director at the Urban Planning Authority, who had established a successful consulting firm specializing in creative community development models for aging populations. "What you're describing isn't just possible, Eleanor," she assured me after hearing my preliminary concept. "It's actually aligned with several grant initiatives currently prioritizing innovative senior housing alternatives. Send me the property details, and I'll run some preliminary feasibility numbers." Over the next 3 days, while participating in Diana's arranged tours of senior living facilities with passive politeness that she interpreted as acceptance, I worked remotely with Marcus and Sophia to develop a comprehensive alternative that drew on both my professional expertise and personal networks. By the time James returned from his business trip, expecting to find me resigned to the institutional options Diana had curated, I had instead finalized a competing vision that would transform not only my own housing situation but potentially the social dynamics of the entire Lakeside Estates community. The confrontation occurred during what was intended as a family dinner to discuss the senior living facility options. Diana had prepared James for what she expected to be a straightforward decision between the three pre-selected communities she had identified as suitable, with cost comparisons and amenity lists neatly organized in the presentation folder beside his dinner plate. Before we discuss these facilities, I interjected calmly after the initial pleasantries, I wanted to share an alternative arrangement I've been developing that better aligns with my needs and preferences. The momentary surprise in their expressions suggested they had genuinely not considered that I might create options beyond those they had selected for me. With practiced professional composure, I outlined the plan that would soon transform both my circumstances and their comfortable assumptions about my limitations. I've made an offer on the foreclosed Victorian property at the entrance to your cul-de-sac, I explained, maintaining the measured tone that had served me through decades of contentious planning meetings. The purchase will be completed using the proceeds from my home sale, with renovation costs covered through a combination of community development grants and private investment from a senior housing innovation fund that Sofia Menendez has helped secure. Their shocked silence as I continued outlining the details reflected dawning recognition that they had severely underestimated both my capabilities and determination. The property would become a model for a concept I had advocated throughout my later career, a cooperative senior living community combining private residences with shared resources and intergenerational programming, designed specifically to keep older adults integrated within existing neighborhoods rather than segregated in age-restricted facilities. The main house will accommodate 5 independent living units, including my own apartment on the ground floor, I continued, presenting the architectural renderings Sophia had rushed to prepare. The carriage house will be converted to a community, space for classes, health clinics, and social events open to both residents and neighbors. The grounds will feature accessible community gardens and outdoor gathering areas designed to encourage interaction between our residents and surrounding families. As Diana began to formulate objections focused on zoning restrictions and homeowners association covenants, I calmly addressed each concern with the thoroughness that had characterized my professional problem-solving throughout my career. The property is actually zoned R4, which permits multifamily use with appropriate permitting, which Marcus Williams has already initiated, I explained. And while your homeowners association has aesthetic guidelines, they cannot legally restrict state-approved senior housing initiatives under the Fair Housing Amendments, particularly those receiving federal aging-in-place grant funding. The comprehensive nature of the plan, clearly developed with professional expertise they had dismissed as irrelevant to their world, gradually shifted their expressions from disbelief to concerned calculation. James, recovering his composure first, attempted to reframe my solution as impractical despite its obvious viability. Mom, this seems unnecessarily complicated compared to the excellent facilities Diana has found, he suggested, gesturing toward the now irrelevant brochures. The management responsibilities alone would be overwhelming for someone your age, not to mention the construction oversight and program development. His concern might have appeared genuine to someone who hadn't witnessed the calculated elimination of my promised housing solution in favor of a home theater. I smiled with the patient expression I had perfected when explaining community planning concepts to developers who believed their profit motives were invisibly disguised as public interest. I appreciate your concern, James, but the management structure is already established through integrated senior communities, the nonprofit Sophia directs, I explained. I'll serve on the advisory board and occupy one of the residential units, but the operational responsibilities will be handled by professionals with extensive experience in cooperative senior living models. As the details of the plan became clearer, Diana's expression shifted from dismissive concern to something approaching alarm as she realized the implications for their carefully controlled social environment. "But this would bring significant traffic and activity to our quiet neighborhood," she objected. "The Homeowners Association specifically prohibits commercial operations and high-occupancy housing to maintain property values and community standards." "This isn't commercial property. It's innovative residential use fully compliant with R4 zoning," I corrected gently. "And the intergenerational programming is categorized as private residential activity, similar to hosting frequent dinner parties or family gatherings, which your association explicitly permits." The careful legal and regulatory groundwork that Marcus and Sophia had helped establish, drawing on decades of professional knowledge that James and Diana had dismissed as obsolete, had created a solution that was not only personally appropriate, but essentially challenge-proof against the community restrictions designed specifically to prevent diverse housing options in their exclusive enclave. "The offer has been accepted, and closing is scheduled for next Wednesday," I concluded, gathering the presentation materials as I prepared to end the conversation. "I'll be moving into temporary housing tomorrow while renovations begin, but wanted you to hear about the project directly from me before neighborhood notifications are distributed next week." The stunned silence that followed contained multitudes, recognition of their miscalculation in assuming my passive acceptance of their plans, dawning awareness of how thoroughly they had underestimated my capabilities and connections, and perhaps most significantly, the uncomfortable realization that their attempt to distance themselves from responsibility for my housing would instead bring me and an entire community of active seniors directly into their daily visual field, permanently altering the exclusive environment they had carefully cultivated. "We're only trying to ensure you have appropriate care and support," James finally responded, his tone suggesting he still believed this justification legitimized their broken promises. "This project sounds excessive compared to the excellent professional facilities available." "Different people require different environments to thrive, James," I replied, gathering my things to leave the table. "You assumed what was appropriate for me without meaningful consultation, and I've created an alternative that better meets my actual needs rather than your perception of them. I believe that's what you've always encouraged me to do, adapt with the times rather than holding on to outdated arrangements." The deliberate echo of their own dismissive phrasing about my attachment to my former home and community hung in the air between us as I excused myself, leaving them to contemplate how thoroughly the power dynamic they had assumed was now permanently altered. Their presumption that my age had rendered me passive, malleable, and ultimately disposable had been replaced with the uncomfortable recognition that they were now facing the full professional capabilities and social networks they had conveniently overlooked when making decisions about my future. As I packed my belongings in the guest room that had never been intended as more than temporary accommodation, I reflected on the leadership principles that had guided my professional life. That sustainable communities are built on mutual respect rather than power imbalances, that meaningful solutions emerge from genuine consultation rather than imposed decisions, and that underestimating people based on age or other characteristics usually leads to significant strategic errors. The following morning, I left James and Diana's home quietly, without dramatic confrontation or emotional appeals. The message I left on the immaculately organized kitchen counter was simple and forward-focused. "Thank you for your hospitality during this transition period. I look forward to welcoming you to Winter Haven Senior Cooperative once renovations are complete. The intergenerational programs might be particularly enriching for the children. With love, Mom." The Victorian house that would soon transform into Winter Haven awaited just down the street. Its weathered exterior temporarily shabby, but its bones strong and its potential extraordinary, not unlike the 73-year-old urban planner, whose expertise and determination would soon transform it from neighborhood eyesore to innovative community hub, visible from the front windows of the home where a luxury theater was being constructed in the space that had been promised as her apartment. Sometimes I reflected as I drove toward the temporary housing Sophia had arranged near the renovation site. The most powerful response to being told, "There's no room for you," isn't argument or recrimination, but rather the quiet creation of something so much better that those who dismissed you must daily witness the consequences of their miscalculation. The next chapter was just beginning, and it would unfold directly within view of those who had assumed my story was ending. The transformation of the neglected Victorian into Winter Haven Senior Cooperative began the morning after I left James and Diana's home. As I pulled into the gravel driveway of what would soon become my new community, the property looked even more dilapidated in the harsh morning light than it had during my initial assessment. Paint peeled from elaborate trim work, several porch railings had collapsed entirely, and the once grand entry doors hung slightly askew on damaged hinges. Yet beneath these cosmetic failures, my experienced eye recognized the solid construction and thoughtful design that had allowed the structure to maintain its basic integrity despite years of neglect. Sophia was already waiting, leaning against her car with the relaxed confidence that had made her such an effective deputy during our years working together. At 58, she remained as formidable as when she'd first joined the Urban Development Authority as an idealistic young planner with revolutionary ideas about inclusive design. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in her characteristic, practical bun, and she wore the same style of comfortable blazer and practical shoes that had become her uniform during our countless site inspections together. "It's even better than the listing photos suggested," she announced by way of greeting, gesturing toward the house with genuine enthusiasm rather than empty reassurance. The structural assessment came back yesterday. Foundations solid, roof needs work, but the trusses are intact, and most of the damage is cosmetic or deferred maintenance rather than critical systems. "We can have this place transformed within 4 months if the permits process smoothly." This realistic timeline, which I knew already included buffers for the inevitable complications of any major renovation, represented one of the many reasons I had reached out to Sophia rather than conventional developers. Her decades of experience navigating municipal regulations and coordinating complex projects meant she understood not just the technical aspects of transformation, but the human elements that often determine success or failure in community development initiatives. "Marcus called this morning," she continued as we walked the perimeter of the property, cataloging both challenges and opportunities with practiced efficiency. "The closing is confirmed for Wednesday, and he's arranged for the deed to be held by the newly established Winter Haven Cooperative LLC rather than your name personally. That corporate structure gives us maximum flexibility for the grant funding while protecting your personal assets." This strategic legal framework, established with remarkable speed through Marcus's professional connections, provided essential protection against potential interference from the Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association, which I anticipated would attempt to block the project once they understood its full scope and implications for their carefully controlled community aesthetic. "The contractor team arrives tomorrow to secure the property and begin preliminary demolition work," Sophia explained as we entered the house through a side door with a temperamental lock. "I've scheduled the architectural walkthrough for Thursday morning, assuming the closing proceeds as planned. Elena Kaminsky is handling the design personally. She specializes in adaptive reuse for accessible community spaces." Elena's involvement represented another strategic alliance in our rapidly developing network. As one of the region's most respected architects focusing on universal design principles, her participation lent both practical expertise and valuable credibility to the project. More importantly, her firm had successfully defended multiple legal challenges to innovative housing models, building a reputation for creating designs that satisfied regulatory requirements while pushing conventional boundaries in community development. As we moved through the house's interior, the original grandeur became more apparent despite the superficial damage. 10-foot ceilings with elaborate plasterwork, pocket doors separating generously proportioned rooms, and oversized windows that flooded spaces with natural light despite years of accumulated grime. all suggested the extraordinary potential that had initially caught my attention during my neighborhood walk. The original floor plan works remarkably well for our concept, I noted, mentally placing the 5 planned residential units within the existing structural layout. The main level can accommodate my apartment plus the community kitchen and gathering space with minimal structural changes. The second floor divides naturally into 4 independent units with the existing bathroom locations, and the attic could eventually become additional flex space if needed. Sophia nodded, making notes on her tablet as we discussed placement of accessibility features, necessary system upgrades, and potential preservation of original architectural elements that would maintain the building's character while supporting its new purpose. The carriage house at the property's rear presented additional opportunities, a natural location for the planned health services office, classroom space, and smaller gathering areas that would support the community programming central to the project's mission. As we completed our initial assessment, the temporary caretaker Sophia had arranged arrived to secure the property overnight before construction began. Raymond Chen, a retired contractor who specialized in historic renovations, would live in the carriage house studio during the renovation process, providing both security and valuable on-site expertise as the project developed. Mrs. Winters, he greeted me with respectful formality that gradually gave way to professional enthusiasm as we discussed the property's challenges and potential. The craftsmanship in this place is remarkable. You don't see this quality of millwork in modern construction. These old Victorians were built to last centuries if properly maintained. His detailed knowledge of traditional building techniques and authentic restoration methods would prove invaluable in the coming months as we balanced modernization needs with preservation of the architectural elements that gave the property its distinctive character. More importantly, his presence would ensure continuous oversight during the critical early phases when the property was most vulnerable to both weather damage and potential vandalism. As I prepared to leave for the temporary apartment Sophia had arranged in a nearby senior community, Raymond offered an observation that crystallized the symbolic significance of the project beyond its practical purpose. You know, when these grand old Victorians were built, they were designed for extended family living, multiple generations under one roof, with specialized spaces for different needs and activities, he noted, running an appreciative hand along an intricately carved banister. We've lost that concept in modern housing, where everyone's isolated in their separate properties. What you're doing here is bringing back that multi-generational community model, just in a new form that respects modern privacy needs while maintaining the connected living that made these places special. This insight, recognizing the project as both innovation and reclamation of valuable social patterns, perfectly articulated what had drawn me to the property beyond its strategic location, visible from James and Diana's front windows. In many ways, Winter Haven would embody the community planning principles I had advocated throughout my career, demonstrating that aging populations could remain integrated within existing neighborhoods rather than segregated in institutional settings that severed lifelong social connections. The temporary apartment where I would live during renovations offered a stark contrast to both my former home and the emerging Winter Haven vision. Located in Ridgewood Senior Estates, a conventional age-restricted community 15 minutes from Lakeside Estates, the sterile one-bedroom unit represented exactly the type of disconnected institutional living arrangement James and Diana had, selected as appropriate for my advancing years. While clean and functional, the space lacked both character and context, interchangeable with thousands of similar units in similar facilities throughout the country, designed for efficiency rather than authentic community integration. It's just for 4 months, Sophia reassured me, correctly reading my expression as we arranged my limited belongings in the impersonal space. And the short-term lease gives you valuable comparative experience to inform Winter Haven's development. Sometimes understanding what doesn't work is as important as knowing what does. This perspective, finding value even in temporary arrangements that contradicted my preferences, reflected the practical wisdom that had made Sophia such an effective planner. Throughout my career, I had similarly emphasized the importance of learning from suboptimal environments rather than simply criticizing their limitations, an approach that had helped transform numerous challenging community developments into unexpected successes. The weeks following closing proceeded with remarkable efficiency, testament to the professional network Sophia and I had mobilized around the Winter Haven concept. Elena's architectural team developed detailed renovation plans that preserved the Victorian's character, while incorporating universal design principles that would accommodate changing needs as residents aged. Marcus navigated the permitting process with strategic precision, leveraging both his legal expertise and long-standing relationships with municipal authorities to address potential regulatory barriers before they could delay construction. Meanwhile, Raymond coordinated the initial construction phase with meticulous attention to both preservation priorities and accessibility requirements, ensuring that modern interventions remained harmonious with the building's historic character. By the third week, obvious transformation was visible even from the street. Repaired porch railings, fresh paint on newly restored trim work, and professionally landscaped front gardens that replaced the overgrown neglect that had previously characterized the property. These visible improvements, deliberately prioritized in the construction sequence to demonstrate immediate progress, had precisely the effect I had anticipated in the surrounding community. Neighbors who had viewed the deteriorating property as a threat to their carefully maintained home values now passed by regularly to observe the renovation, often stopping to ask questions about the building's history and planned use. These informal conversations provided perfect opportunities to introduce the Winter Haven concept in non-threatening, individually tailored ways that built gradual support rather than triggering immediate resistance. "So this is going to be your private residence?" asked Caroline Mitchell, who lived 3 doors down from James and Diana, during one such conversation as she walked her perfectly groomed bichon frise past the property. "It will be my home, yes, but also a small community of active seniors who want to remain engaged in neighborhood life rather than moving to isolated facilities," I explained, emphasizing aspects likely to resonate with her values based on the pride she clearly took in her own immaculate property. The renovations will restore the building to its original grandeur while incorporating subtle modern updates that allow residents to age in place comfortably. "That sounds lovely," she responded with what appeared to be genuine interest. "My mother struggled terribly with loneliness after moving to a senior facility across town. She lost connection with all her neighbors of 30 years practically overnight. These personal connections, each building incremental support for the concept, created a foundation of community acceptance that would prove crucial when more organized opposition eventually emerged. Rather than encountering Winter Haven as an abstract threat to property values or community character, neighbors increasingly viewed the project through the lens of individual relationships and potential personal benefit as they contemplated their own future aging needs. The first official challenge arose, predictably, from the Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association 3 weeks into construction, when the project's full scope became impossible to ignore. The hand-delivered letter, addressed to me at my temporary apartment with copies to the Municipal Planning Department and Building Authority, cited 11 alleged violations of community covenants, from unauthorized multifamily occupancy to aesthetic inconsistency with established neighborhood character. The timing and comprehensive nature of the objections suggested professional legal involvement, likely at significant expense to the association. The letter concluded with explicit threat of injunctive relief if construction did not cease immediately, pending thorough review by the association's architectural committee, a committee I knew was chaired by Diana's close friend Catherine Blackwell, whose husband's law firm specialized in real estate and covenant enforcement. Rather than responding directly, which would have legitimized the association's questionable jurisdiction over the property, I forwarded the letter to Marcus, who had anticipated precisely this challenge and prepared accordingly. His response, delivered to the association board the following morning with copies to appropriate municipal authorities, methodically dismantled their objections with devastating legal precision. As counsel for Winter Haven Senior Cooperative, LLC, I must correct several fundamental misunderstandings in your recent communication. His letter began with deceptive mildness before systematically addressing each alleged violation with reference to specific municipal codes, state statutes, and federal housing regulations that protected the project from exactly the type of discriminatory restriction the association sought to impose. Most significantly, Marcus emphasized the property's technical status outside the association's jurisdiction, despite its location at the entrance to the cul-de-sac. While visually integrated with Lakeside Estates, 1875 Victorian Lane was developed prior to the establishment of your planned community and explicitly excluded from association governance in the original development agreement filed with county records, his letter explained, citing documentary evidence that the development company had deliberately avoided incorporating the historic property into their regulatory framework due to potential restoration complications. This technical distinction, which I had verified, before making the initial purchase offer, created critical legal protection against the association's most powerful enforcement mechanisms. While they could attempt to influence municipal authorities through political pressure, they could not directly impose their restrictive covenants on a property explicitly excluded from their jurisdiction in legally filed documents. Marcus's response concluded with subtle but unmistakable warning about potential consequences of continued interference. Any actions impeding the development of appropriate senior housing accommodations could potentially violate federal fair housing statutes regarding age-related reasonable accommodations, exposing the association to significant liability beyond simple regulatory compliance issues. This measured reference to potential legal counterclaims, supported by the grant funding and federal Aging-in-Place program participation that Sophia had secured, effectively neutralized the association's initial regulatory challenge. While individual members might continue opposing the project through informal channels, the association's formal options were severely limited by the combination of jurisdictional exclusion and federal protection we had strategically established. The vaci afternoon following Marcus's response, I received an unexpected text message from James. Need to discuss the situation with the house. Are you available for coffee tomorrow? The deliberate vagueness, the situation, rather than your project or Winter Haven, and formal tone suggested he was approaching our meeting as business negotiation rather than family conversation. This framing, while disappointingly impersonal, actually served my purposes by establishing clear boundaries for the discussion, rather than attempting to leverage emotional family dynamics to influence my decisions. We arranged to meet at a neutral location, a coffee shop equidistant between his office and my temporary apartment, rather than either of our residences. This venue selection reinforced the professional rather than personal nature of the conversation, while providing public setting that would likely moderate any potential confrontational behavior on either side. James arrived precisely on time the following day, dressed in the business casual attire that represented his standard professional uniform, crisp button-down shirt, tailored slacks, and the expensive watch Diana had given him for their 10th anniversary. His expression suggested someone preparing for difficult negotiation, a combination of determination and carefully managed tension that I recognized from countless municipal hearings with resistant stakeholders. "Mom," he began after minimal pleasantries, leaning forward slightly in what appeared to be practiced body language intended to convey sincere concern. "I think there's been a significant misunderstanding about the Winter Haven project that's creating unnecessary community tension." The framing was precisely what I had anticipated, recasting legitimate difference in priorities as misunderstanding that could be resolved through proper explanation rather than fundamental conflict requiring mutual compromise. This communication strategy, which I had encountered repeatedly throughout my professional career, typically preceded attempts to reposition established projects through appealing to alternative options that would ultimately serve the explainer's interests rather than the established objectives. What specific aspects do you believe have been misunderstood? I asked, maintaining neutral tone while accepting nothing in his characterization. Diana and I fully support your desire for independent living rather than a traditional senior facility, he continued, confirming my expectation that he would present revised version of their position rather than acknowledging their original dismissal of my preferences. We're just concerned that taking on a project of this magnitude creates unnecessary stress and responsibility at a time when you should be enjoying retirement. This reframing, presenting their opposition as concern for my welfare rather than protection of their property values and community aesthetic, represented classic misdirection that I had encountered countless times during contentious development negotiations. By positioning themselves as advocates for my interests rather than opponents of my choices, they attempted to create false alignment that could then be leveraged toward their preferred outcome. The Winter Haven model actually distributes responsibilities across professional management rather than placing burdens on individual residents, I explained, addressing the stated concern rather than challenging the underlying motivation. My involvement focuses on program development and community integration rather than property management or administrative functions. James nodded with the exaggerated attentiveness that often preceded introduction of alternative proposals. That's reassuring to hear. We just wonder if similar benefits might be achieved through less complex arrangements. For instance, we've found a lovely garden apartment community near the cultural district that offers independent living with optional support services. The units have private entrances and patios, but without the complications of managing an entire property. The counteroffer, presenting pre-selected alternative that addressed surface-level concerns while maintaining the fundamental separation they desired, followed the predictable negotiation pattern I had anticipated. The suggested garden apartments, while nominally independent, would still remove me from their immediate community while continuing the pattern of others defining my housing options, rather than respecting my capacity for self-determination. James, I responded directly, setting aside the professional detachment that had characterized our conversation thus far. Let me be very clear about something fundamental. After a lifetime making community development decisions professionally, I am fully capable of evaluating housing options for myself. Winter Haven isn't just about my personal housing. It's about creating a model for integrated senior living that benefits the entire community, including your family. This redirection, from defensive justification to affirmative vision, shifted the conversation away from negotiating compromises on my living arrangements toward the broader community benefits that even self-interested neighbors might eventually appreciate. Rather than engaging with his implicit suggestion that I should abandon Winter Haven for their preferred alternative, I refocused on the project's value proposition that extended beyond my individual situation. The intergenerational programs we're developing will offer enrichment opportunities for neighborhood children, including your own, I continued, emphasizing benefits directly relevant to his family. The health monitoring services we're establishing will provide emergency response capabilities for the entire cul-de-sac. The community gardens will produce fresh organic vegetables that we'll share with surrounding households. This deliberate emphasis on mutual benefit rather than individual accommodation represented strategic application of the community development principles that had guided my professional practice, finding common interests that could bridge seemingly opposed positions rather than engaging in zero-sum negotiations where one party's gain necessitated another's loss. James's expression revealed the effectiveness of this approach, transitioning from practiced negotiation posture to more genuine consideration as the potential benefits became more concrete. What specifically are you envisioning for these intergenerational programs? He asked, his tone suggesting authentic curiosity rather than tactical engagement. We're establishing a homework support program staffed by former educators among our residents, a weekend coding club led by a retired computer science professor who's joining the community, and seasonal gardening workshops where children learn sustainable food production alongside experienced gardeners, I explained, describing programs we had actually begun developing rather than vague theoretical possibilities. As I outlined these concrete initiatives, James's resistance visibly diminished, replaced by reluctant recognition of potential value that aligned with his own parenting priorities, particularly the STEM education emphasis he had consistently prioritized for his children. The coding club specifically addressed his often stated concern about technology education opportunities in their community, offering specialized mentorship he had previously driven 30 minutes to access at a university-sponsored program. Those actually sound like programs the kids would enjoy, he acknowledged, the first genuine positive assessment he had offered since the project began. Parker especially would benefit from coding mentorship with his interest in game development. This small opening, acknowledging potential value rather than focusing exclusively on perceived problems, provided foundation for gradual relationship repair that might eventually transform their opposition to cautious support. Rather than pressing this advantage immediately, I simply nodded acknowledgement while allowing the possibility to register fully in his considerations. As our meeting concluded with notably warmer interaction than it had begun, James offered an observation that suggested incremental progress in his understanding of both my capabilities and determination. You know, I probably shouldn't be surprised you've thought through all these angles so thoroughly. You always were the most strategic thinker in any room, even when I was convinced I knew better. This acknowledgement, however belated, of my professional competence rather than dismissing my plans as elderly stubbornness, represented meaningful evolution in his perspective. While far from full endorsement of either Winter Haven specifically or my autonomous decision-making generally, it suggested potential pathway toward mutual respect that had seemed impossible during the basement apartment deception. As I watched him walk toward his car, I reflected on the community development principle that had guided my most successful professional projects. That sustainable change rarely occurs through confrontation or capitulation, but through persistent demonstration of shared benefits that gradually transform opposition into partnership. The conversation had established foundation for that transformation, creating possibility that James and Diana might eventually recognize Winter Haven not as threat to their community vision, but as enhancement that benefited their family directly. Returning to the construction site that afternoon, I found Elena's architectural team finalizing placement of the accessibility features that would allow residents to age in place without institutional aesthetics that typically characterized senior housing. Rather than obvious grab bars and clinical-looking supports, they had integrated assistance features into design elements that maintained the Victorian character while providing necessary functional support. We're using these decorative wooden panels as disguised grab bars in the hallways, Elena explained, demonstrating how the carved elements provided both aesthetic continuity with original features and secure support for residents with mobility challenges. The bathroom fixtures incorporate universal design principles while maintaining period-appropriate appearances. Even the modified staircase preserves the original banister while adding subtle safety features. This thoughtful integration, maintaining architectural integrity while incorporating necessary modifications, represented exactly the balance I had envisioned when selecting the property. Rather than institutional setting that announced senior housing through clinical features, Winter Haven would present as beautifully restored historic home that happened to incorporate accessibility elements benefiting residents of all ages. C. Construction progressed through its second month. The visible transformation increasingly attracted attention beyond immediate neighbors. A feature article in the local newspaper's home section, arranged through Sophia's media contacts, portrayed the project as innovative preservation effort that repurposed historic architecture for contemporary community needs, emphasizing the property's restoration rather than its regulatory challenges. Victorian gem reborn, historic home transforms into innovative senior community, the headline announced above photographs contrasting the property's previously neglected condition with the emerging restoration. The article featured interviews with Elena about architectural preservation, Raymond discussing traditional craftsmanship being incorporated into the renovation, and brief comments from me about the community integration model we were developing. This positive media coverage, strategically focused on broadly appealing aspects rather than potentially controversial senior housing elements, created public narrative around Winter Haven as community asset rather than regulatory controversy. By emphasizing historic preservation, architectural significance, and neighborhood revitalization rather than challenging conventional senior housing models, the article generated supportive public interest that would make continued opposition increasingly difficult to maintain. The neighborhood response evolved accordingly, with initial wariness gradually giving way to cautious curiosity as the property's transformation became more apparent. Several neighbors, including Caroline Mitchell with her Bichon Frise, began stopping regularly to inquire about construction progress and specific design features. These informal conversations provided perfect opportunities to incorporate community feedback into evolving plans while building relationships that would support Winter Haven's integration once operational. Have you considered hosting a neighborhood open house once construction reaches an appropriate stage? Suggested Caroline during one such conversation. I think many residents would appreciate seeing the restoration work up close, especially those interested in historical architecture. This suggestion, which aligned perfectly with our community engagement strategy without appearing to originate from us, provided ideal opportunity to normalize Winter Haven's presence within the neighborhood social context. An invitation-only preview event would allow controlled introduction to the concept while establishing social connections before operational complexities could generate specific complaints. That's a wonderful idea, I responded with genuine enthusiasm. Perhaps you could help identify residents with particular interest in historical properties or community resources who might appreciate early preview. We'd want to keep initial tours manageable while construction is still underway. This collaborative framing, inviting her participation in shaping the event rather than simply accepting her suggestion, established mutual investment that would help transform her from interested observer to active supporter. By gradually incorporating neighbors into Winter Haven's development process through such modest engagements, we created an expanding network of community stakeholders with personal connection to the project's success. The most significant breakthrough in community perception occurred unexpectedly in late June, when severe thunderstorms caused power outages throughout lakeside estates, including James and Diana's cul-de-sac. While most residents faced at least 24 hours without electricity during the intense summer heat, Winter Haven's recently installed backup generator system, designed specifically to protect vulnerable senior residents during emergencies, continued functioning without interruption. "We noticed your lights were still on during the blackout," commented Robert Peterson, who lived directly across from James and Diana, when he encountered me at the construction site the following day. "The power company says we might not get service restored until tomorrow with temperatures hitting the 90s. This observation presented perfect opportunity to demonstrate Winter Haven's community benefit model in practical application rather than theoretical discussion. After brief consultation with Sophia and Raymond, who confirmed our systems could handle additional load without compromising construction needs, we established an impromptu cooling station in the nearly completed community room, offering neighbors access to air conditioning, device charging, and refrigeration for essential medications during the extended outage. The response was immediate and transformative. Over the course of that day, 17 families from surrounding homes visited Winter Haven, experiencing the emerging community space while benefiting from practical assistance during genuine need. Rather than abstract concept that might affect property values or neighborhood character, Winter Haven became tangible resource providing immediate value during community crisis. Most significantly, James and Diana visited with their children late that afternoon, Diana's initial reluctance, visibly giving way to relief as their visibly uncomfortable children experienced air conditioning for the first time that day. While their interaction remained somewhat guarded, the necessary expression of gratitude for practical assistance created social obligation that subtly shifted the relationship dynamic from opposition to reluctant appreciation. The kids were struggling with the heat, James acknowledged as they prepared to leave after several hours. Parker's asthma acts up in these conditions, and the house was getting dangerously warm without air conditioning. This simple statement, acknowledging vulnerability and accepting assistance, represented meaningful progress from the dismissive certainty that had characterized their previous approach to Winter Haven. While far from enthusiastic support, their willingness to enter the space and accept help during genuine need created experiential connection that abstract discussions could never achieve. As they departed with charged devices, cooled household, members and medications safely stored in our refrigeration until their power returned, Diana paused momentarily in the doorway. "The restoration work is actually quite beautiful," she commented with apparent surprise, gesturing toward the carefully preserved crown molding and restored hardwood floors. "You can really see the original character coming through." This small acknowledgement, focusing on aesthetic appreciation rather than functional benefit, suggested potential pathway toward reconciliation through gradually expanded recognition of Winter Haven's multiple value dimensions. Rather than single-issue opposition based on perceived property value impacts, they had begun experiencing the project's actual qualities directly, allowing incremental reassessment based on evidence rather than assumption. As July arrived and construction entered its final phases, the neighborhood conversation around Winter Haven had transformed substantially from the initial alarm and opposition. The impromptu cooling station during the power outage had established practical community benefit beyond theoretical promises, while visible restoration quality had converted aesthetic concerns into appreciation for neighborhood improvement. Most significantly, the scheduled preview event, organized with Caroline Mitchell's assistance, had expanded from originally planned modest gathering to community-wide interest, requiring implementation of multiple small group tours rather than single open house to accommodate everyone requesting participation. This enthusiastic response represented remarkable evolution from the association's initial cease and desist demands just months earlier. As I observed this transformation from my temporary apartment in the conventional senior community that would soon be my former residence, I reflected on the planning principle that had guided my most successful professional projects, that communities ultimately embrace changes they participate in shaping, even when initially resisting external imposition of similar concepts. By creating multiple pathways for neighborhood involvement in Winter Haven's development, we had transformed potential opposition into emerging partnership that would sustain the project beyond initial implementation. The contrast between Winter Haven's integrated community model and my temporary institutional housing grew increasingly stark as moving day approached. While Ridgewood Senior Estates offered functional accommodations and scheduled activities, its fundamental design separated residents from broader community context, creating artificial environment defined by age segregation rather than authentic social integration. 3 days before my scheduled move into my completed Winter Haven apartment, James texted again with unexpected message. "Diana and I would like to help with your moving day if you'd accept the assistance. The kids want to see your new place too." This simple offer, practical support without policy commentary or strategic negotiation, suggested genuine relationship repair beyond merely practical accommodation to unavoidable change. While substantial differences likely remained in our perspectives on appropriate senior living arrangements, their willingness to participate in establishing my new residence represented meaningful acknowledgement of both my choice and their familial connection to its success. "I'd appreciate the help," I responded simply, accepting the gesture at face value rather than analyzing potential ulterior motives. "The moving company handles the furniture Friday morning, but family assistance with personal items would be Welcome that afternoon. This straightforward acceptance, neither excessively grateful nor suspicious, established foundation for potential new relationship framework based on mutual respect rather than power dynamics or manipulative persuasion. Whether their evolving perspective resulted from community pressure as neighborhood opinion shifted, genuine reassessment based on Winter Haven's obvious quality, or simple acceptance of immovable reality remained unclear and ultimately irrelevant to the practical collaboration now possible. 3 months after leaving their home when told, "There's no room for you," I prepared to move into the beautiful Victorian apartment I had created through professional expertise they had dismissed as irrelevant, supported by community networks they had never valued, and funded through resources they had assumed insufficient without their management. The completed Winter Haven Senior Cooperative stood as physical manifestation of capabilities they had underestimated and determination they had fatally misjudged. What had begun as painful rejection had transformed through strategic response into something far more valuable than the basement apartment they had promised, but never intended to create. Not just personal housing solution, but innovative community model that would benefit dozens of seniors seeking alternatives to institutional settings while demonstrating practical implementation of the integrated housing principles I had advocated throughout my professional career. As I packed my belongings in preparation for the move, I reflected on the leadership lesson that had guided my most successful planning initiatives, that authentic innovation emerges most powerfully from necessity when conventional options prove inadequate or unavailable. What James and Diana had intended as convenient disposal of inconvenient parent had instead catalyzed creation of community resource that would serve as model for similar developments throughout the region, potentially transforming senior housing, approaches far beyond our immediate neighborhood. Sometimes I realized as I prepared to leave institutional housing for the vibrant community we had created, being told, "There's no room for you," becomes unexpected gift when it motivates creation of spaces infinitely better than those being denied. The rooms James and Diana had refused to provide had multiplied into entire community of possibilities they never imagined. Visible through their front windows as daily reminder that underestimating elderly parent with lifetime of professional expertise represented miscalculation whose consequences would transform not just my life, but an entire community concept. While the children explored with increasing enthusiasm, James and Diana moved somewhat awkwardly through the space, their expressions suggesting internal recalibration of expectations confronted with physical evidence contradicting their assumptions. The quality of finishes, thoughtful design integration, and obvious care in balancing historical elements with modern functionality challenged their narrative about impractical elderly attachment to inappropriate living arrangements. "This is not what I expected," Diana finally acknowledged as she examined the kitchen's subtle accessibility features: pull-out shelving, variable height work surfaces, and appliances selected specifically for usability across changing physical capabilities. "It's actually quite elegant without looking institutional at all." This reluctant admission, acknowledging quality while still maintaining distance through somewhat clinical assessment, represented tentative opening toward potential reassessment rather than entrenched opposition. Rather than defending Winter Haven or highlighting how thoroughly it contradicted their previous dismissal, I simply acknowledged her observation while continuing unpacking, allowing the physical reality to speak for itself more convincingly than any verbal argument could achieve. As the afternoon progressed, the initially awkward atmosphere gradually relaxed into more natural interaction, centered around practical activities rather than strained conversation. James assembled bookshelves while Diana organized kitchen items, their physical participation in establishing my new home, creating tangible investment in its success beyond theoretical acceptance. The children moved between helping with age-appropriate tasks and exploring features that captured their interest, particularly the technology integration that allowed traditional-appearing fixtures to incorporate modern functionality. "Mom," Parker mentioned you're planning a coding program for neighborhood. Kids? James asked as he adjusted shelf height in the living room bookcase, his tone suggesting genuine inquiry rather than challenge. He's been wanting more advanced instruction than his school provides. This opening, focused on practical programming, rather than philosophical disagreement about senior living models, provided perfect opportunity to build functional relationship without requiring explicit acknowledgement of previous conflict. Yes, we've arranged for Professor Martin Chen to lead weekly sessions once the community room is fully equipped, I explained, emphasizing the professional credentials that would appeal to James's educational priorities for his children. He taught computer science at the university for 30 years before retiring, and he's developing curriculum specifically for different skill levels. Parker would definitely be interested in participating, James responded, the simple statement representing significant evolution from their previous resistance to any connection with Winter Haven programming. His school doesn't offer much beyond basic computer literacy despite all their STEM marketing. This practical opening, based on mutual interest in Parker's educational development rather than abstract principles, established pathway for incremental relationship repair through collaborative problem-solving rather than requiring emotional reconciliation that might still feel inaccessible given recent conflict. By focusing on tangible benefits Winter Haven could provide for their children, we created foundation for potential partnership that acknowledged interdependence rather than maintaining artificial separation between our lives. As evening approached, and unpacking reached natural pause point, I surprised them with suggestion that directly addressed the underlying family dynamics, without requiring explicit discussion of past disagreements. Would you all consider staying for a simple dinner? The kitchen is functional, and I have everything needed for pasta that the children might help prepare. This invitation, extending our functional collaboration into more personal shared experience, represented deliberate step toward potential relationship normalization, without demanding premature closure regarding underlying conflicts. Their hesitation was momentary but noticeable, silent communication passing between James and Diana as they assessed implications beyond the simple meal proposal. That would be nice, Diana responded with what appeared to be genuine rather than obligatory acceptance. The children don't have activities tonight, and we haven't planned anything specific for dinner. The meal preparation that followed created unexpected space for natural interaction outside the constrained patterns that had characterized our recent relationship. As I taught Emma proper technique for rolling pasta dough while Parker helped James chop vegetables for the sauce, the shared activity established collaborative framework that temporarily suspended the power dynamics and status considerations that had fueled previous conflicts. Grandmother, where did you learn to make pasta like this? Emma asked as she carefully turned the pasta machine handle under my guidance, genuine curiosity replacing the cautious distance that had previously characterized our limited interactions. My neighbor, Mrs. Gianelli, taught me when I was a young widow trying to manage work and raising your father alone, I explained, sharing family history she had likely never heard, given James's tendency to minimize his childhood circumstances in constructing his narrative of self-made success. She watched over your father after school while I finished work at the planning department, and cooking lessons became our way of exchanging support instead of payment she wouldn't accept. This simple story, highlighting community interdependence, rather than isolated self-sufficiency, illustrated Winter Haven's foundational philosophy more effectively than abstract explanation could achieve. The concrete example of mutual support between neighbors with different resources and needs demonstrated the practical benefits of connected community living rather than theoretical social benefits that might seem irrelevant to their individualistic worldview. As we gathered around the dining table that had witnessed 4 decades of community gatherings in my previous home, the conversation flowed with surprising ease, centered primarily around the children's interests and activities, rather than addressing the complex adult tensions still simmering beneath surface pleasantries. This focus on neutral territory created space for genuine connection without requiring premature resolution of deeper conflicts that would necessarily require longer healing process. Before you leave, would you like to see the community garden planning? I offered as dinner concluded, recognizing opportunity to demonstrate another aspect of Winter Haven's intergenerational programming. We've designed specific plots for children, to maintain with resident mentoring if Emma might be interested. This invitation, extended specifically toward Emma's potential involvement rather than general information sharing, created another concrete connection point beyond abstract community benefits. As we examined the garden layouts together, Emma's usually reserved expression brightened with unexpected enthusiasm when she spotted the butterfly garden section designed specifically to support pollinators while providing educational opportunities for younger participants. "I did a science project on monarch butterflies last year," she volunteered with unusual animation. "My teacher said we need more butterfly habitats because they're losing their natural environments." This shared interest, connecting her school, learning with Winter Haven's practical implementation, established another potential bridge between previously separated worlds. "We actually need someone with butterfly knowledge to help select the best plants for our butterfly sanctuary section," I suggested, creating specific role that respected her knowledge rather than treating her as generic child participant. "Would you be interested in helping design that area when planting begins next month?" Her enthusiastic acceptance, immediately turning to her parents with hopeful expression that silently requested their approval, created gentle pressure that subtly reinforced emerging connection rather than continued separation. Diana's hesitation was momentary but noticeable before she nodded agreement, perhaps recognizing that arbitrary resistance would potentially damage her relationship with her daughter rather than simply maintaining boundary with me. As they prepared to leave several hours after their initially planned brief visit, the atmosphere had transformed remarkably from the cautious formality of their arrival. While fundamental differences likely remained in our perspectives on appropriate senior living arrangements and family obligations, the practical collaboration around settling my new home had established foundation for potential relationship repair without requiring explicit acknowledgement of previous conflict. "We'd be happy to help when the other residents start moving in next week if you need additional assistance," James offered as they gathered their things, the suggestion representing significant evolution from their previous opposition to Winter Haven's very existence. "Parker and Emma could help with the children's library organization on Saturday if that would be useful." This voluntary extension of involvement, framed as practical assistance rather than philosophical endorsement, suggested genuine shift in their approach to Winter Haven from obstacle to be removed toward reality, to be accommodated and potentially leveraged for family benefit. While far from enthusiastic embrace of the community living model or acknowledgement of their previous dismissal of my capabilities, their willingness to participate in establishing the community represented meaningful progress toward potential reconciliation. "That would be very helpful," I accepted simply, neither exaggerating gratitude nor highlighting the irony of their assistance establishing the project they had initially opposed. "Professor Chen will be here Saturday morning to set up the technology lab if Parker wants to meet him directly regarding the coding program." As they departed with plans for specific future involvement rather than vague promises of eventual contact, I reflected on the community development principle that had guided many of my most successful professional projects, that sustainable relationships develop through practical collaboration around mutual interests rather than abstract agreement about theoretical principles. By creating concrete opportunities for their participation that benefited their children directly, we had established potential partnership framework without requiring explicit admission of previous misjudgment. The following week brought Winter Haven fully to life as the remaining residents moved into their apartments, each bringing unique skills and experiences that would contribute to our emerging community culture. Dr. Margaret Chen, a retired physician whose apartment occupied the second floor above mine, established the health monitoring program that would provide both residents and surrounding neighbors with regular wellness checks and emergency response protocols. Professor Samuel Richardson, former literature professor whose love of books had generated collection too large for conventional senior housing, organized the community library with assistance from neighborhood children, including Emma, who took particular pride in arranging the children's section according to her carefully considered categorization system. The intergenerational activities that had existed as theoretical programming during planning stages quickly materialized as living reality, creating natural connection points between Winter Haven residents and surrounding community that transcended conventional senior housing isolation. Weekend workshops in the carriage house classroom drew participants from throughout Lakeside Estates, gradually transforming perception of Winter Haven from unwelcome intrusion to valuable community resource offering enrichment opportunities previously unavailable within the development. Most significant for my personal situation, Parker and Emma became regular participants in Winter Haven activities, their initial curiosity evolving into genuine enthusiasm that gradually influenced their parents' perspective. Parker's Saturday morning coding sessions with Professor Chen developed into serious technical mentorship that addressed specific interests beyond his school curriculum, while Emma's involvement in the Butterfly Garden and Children's Library created meaningful responsibility that respected her capabilities rather than treating her as passive participant. These concrete benefits, tangibly addressing their children's developmental needs rather than abstract community values, provided James and Diana with personally relevant reasons to reconsider their opposition to Winter Haven beyond simple acceptance of unchangeable reality. Their gradually increasing involvement, while likely motivated initially by their children's interests rather than philosophical reassessment, created experiential exposure to the community model that theoretical explanations could never achieve. 6. Weeks after moving day, as Winter Haven's operations stabilized into sustainable rhythms, I received unexpected text message from James. "Would you be available for coffee tomorrow afternoon? There's something I'd like to discuss." The neutral phrasing and lack of specific context created momentary concern about potential new conflict, but I responded with simple acceptance, suggesting the same coffee shop where we had conducted our previous negotiation conversation. This neutral territory would provide appropriate setting for whatever discussion he proposed, without the emotional complications of either his home or Winter Haven. James arrived precisely on time the following afternoon, his expression suggesting internal preparation for significant conversation rather than casual check-in. After brief pleasantries and coffee orders, he addressed the purpose of our meeting with uncharacteristic directness. "Mom, I owe you an apology," he began, maintaining eye contact rather than the evasive gaze that had characterized many of our difficult conversations. Not just for the basement apartment situation, though that certainly requires acknowledgement, but for fundamentally underestimating both your capabilities and your understanding of your own needs. This unexpected opening, directly acknowledging both specific betrayal and broader pattern of dismissal, suggested genuine reflection rather than strategic concession. The straightforward language and absence of qualifying justifications indicated potentially meaningful accountability rather than superficial relationship repair gesture. "What prompted this reflection?" I asked, neither immediately accepting the apology nor dismissing its significance, but seeking understanding of the developmental process rather than simple closure. Honestly, watching Winter Haven evolve from concept to functioning reality despite our opposition, he acknowledged, with remarkable candor, seeing how thoroughly we misjudged what you would create when we assumed our options were the only viable possibilities. But more personally, recognizing patterns in my own behavior that reflect values I don't actually want to embody or pass to my children. This deeper self-examination, connecting specific actions toward me with broader values assessment, suggested genuine growth rather than situational adaptation to unchangeable circumstances. His willingness to examine underlying patterns rather than simply acknowledging specific incidents indicated potential for meaningful relationship transformation rather than superficial conflict resolution. Diana and I have been doing some difficult reflection about the values we're modeling for Parker and Emma, he continued when I remained thoughtfully silent. The children's involvement with Winterhaven has highlighted community connection benefits we've systematically eliminated from our lives through neighborhood choice, scheduling priorities, and social patterns focused entirely on achievement and status rather than genuine relationship. This broader reassessment, expanding beyond our specific conflict to examine fundamental lifestyle choices, represented significant evolution from the property value-focused resistance that had characterized their initial opposition to Winterhaven. The willingness to question core assumptions about appropriate living arrangements suggested potential openness to alternatives beyond the individualistic success model that had previously defined their worldview. I'm not suggesting we'll suddenly embrace communal living or abandon our home for Winterhaven-style arrangements. He clarified with honesty that respected both his continuing differences and my intelligence. But we are reconsidering the extreme isolation we've created through choices we previously defended as privacy and independence, without examining their costs to our family's actual well-being. This nuanced position, acknowledging reconsideration without claiming complete philosophical transformation, offered authentic foundation for relationship repair based on mutual respect rather than artificial agreement. By maintaining honest recognition of continuing differences while acknowledging legitimate reassessment, he created possibility for genuine relationship rather than superficial reconciliation that would inevitably collapse under future stress. The children's enthusiasm for Winterhaven activities revealed something we hadn't recognized, he continued, sharing insight that clearly represented painful self-examination. They were genuinely lonely in our supposedly perfect neighborhood, where privacy and property values had completely replaced community connection. Watching them thrive with intergenerational mentoring and meaningful responsibilities has forced us to question arrangements we previously defended as optimal family environment. This recognition that their children's needs transcended the material security and educational credentials they had prioritized suggested fundamental values, reassessment rather than simply tactical adjustment to Winterhaven's unavoidable presence. Their willingness to acknowledge benefits they had previously dismissed indicated genuine openness to learning rather than mere tolerance of unchangeable circumstances. I can't undo the betrayal of the basement apartment promise, he acknowledged, directly addressing the specific harmful action, rather than focusing exclusively on philosophical reassessment. That represented fundamental breach of trust motivated by convenience and conflict avoidance, rather than genuine concern for your welfare. I can only acknowledge it was wrong, both the deception itself and the dismissal of your capabilities and preferences it represented. This specific accountability, naming the betrayal without qualification or justification, offered essential foundation for potential trust rebuilding that general philosophical discussion could never provide. By directly acknowledging both, the action and motivations without defensive explanations, he demonstrated understanding of the harm beyond simple recognition of practical outcomes. My response formed carefully, balancing acknowledgement of his apparent sincerity with appropriate caution about premature closure of significant violation. I appreciate your reflection and specific acknowledgement of both the action and its meaning, I replied after thoughtful consideration. Trust rebuilding necessarily takes time and consistent demonstration rather than single conversations, but this represents meaningful beginning of that process. This measured response, neither rejecting his apology nor granting immediate absolution, established realistic framework for gradual relationship repair based on continuing evidence rather than emotional closure that might prove premature. By acknowledging potential process while maintaining appropriate boundaries, I created pathway for rebuilding without vulnerability to repeated harm through premature trust restoration. That's fair and more generous than I might deserve, he acknowledged with surprising humility. I'm not asking for immediate trust restoration or pretending single conversation resolves the harm caused. I'm simply committing to demonstrated change moving forward, beginning with proper respect for your capabilities and choices, rather than the patronizing certainty that characterized our previous interactions. This realistic expectation, focusing on future behavior rather than immediate emotional resolution, suggested genuine understanding of trust dynamics rather than self-centered demand for forgiveness that characterized many superficial apologies. His willingness to accept gradual process rather than immediate closure indicated potential maturity beyond the entitled certainty that had informed his previous approach to our relationship. As our conversation concluded with tentative plans for family dinner at Winter Haven the following weekend, I reflected on the community development principle that had guided many successful reconciliation processes throughout my professional career. That transformed relationships require both accountability for specific harms and shared vision for different future interaction patterns. James had offered both, not through dramatic emotional performance, but through straightforward acknowledgement coupled with concrete behavior change already evident in their family's evolving relationship with Winter Haven. Walking back to Winter Haven. Afterward, I passed the basement windows of James and Diana's home, now visible from the street as landscapers completed work around their recently installed home theater entrance. The space that had been promised as my apartment but converted to entertainment showcase had catalyzed series of events that ultimately created something far more valuable than any basement conversion could have achieved. Not just appropriate housing for my specific needs, but innovative community model benefiting dozens of seniors and surrounding neighbors through integrated programming that bridged generational separation. Sometimes, I reflected as I approached Winter Haven's welcoming entrance where residents and neighborhood children gathered for afternoon gardening program. The most powerful response to being told, "There's no room for you," isn't demanding space within existing structures but creating entirely new possibilities that transform limitation into opportunity. The rejection that had initially seemed devastating had ultimately catalyzed creation far more significant than accommodation would have permitted, establishing model that would potentially influence senior housing approaches throughout the region while providing immediate community benefits beyond any individual living arrangement. As Emma spotted me approaching and ran to share exciting news about monarch butterfly eggs discovered on the milkweed plants she had specifically selected for the garden, I recognized the profound wisdom in addressing exclusion through creation rather than complaint. By responding to rejection with innovative development rather than emotional reaction, I had not only secured appropriate housing for myself, but established intergenerational connections that now benefited the very family whose limitations had catalyzed the entire process. Grandmother! The first butterflies should emerge next month, Emma announced with contagious enthusiasm, completely different from the reserved distance that had characterized our earlier interactions. Professor Richardson is helping me document the whole life cycle for my science project. Can we use the classroom projector to present it to the garden club when they're ready? This simple request, assuming ongoing relationship rather than temporary connection, represented the transformed family dynamic that Winter Haven had ultimately facilitated. Through practical collaboration around mutual interests rather than abstract reconciliation discussions, we had established sustainable relationship framework that accommodated continuing differences while creating genuine connection points around shared values that might have remained undiscovered without the catalyst of initial conflict. The son who had once told me, "There's no room for you," now regularly visited the community I had created in response to that rejection, gradually recognizing benefits his limited perspective had initially dismissed as irrelevant or impractical. The rejection that might have relegated me to institutional isolation had instead generated innovative housing model that now enriched multiple generations through connections his carefully controlled environment had systematically eliminated, in prioritizing privacy and status over community engagement. As I helped Emma document the tiny butterfly eggs with the digital microscope Professor Chen had contributed to our science program, I reflected on the leadership lesson that had guided my most successful professional initiatives, That transformative innovation often emerges precisely at points where conventional solutions prove inadequate or unavailable. What began as painful rejection had evolved through strategic response into community resource, whose value even initial opponents now recognized, demonstrating once again that limitations often contain within them the seeds of unprecedented possibility. When approached with creativity rather than constraint, the rooms James and Diana had refused to provide had multiplied into an entire community of possibilities they never imagined. Now visible through their front windows as daily reminder that dismissing a retired urban planner with 4 decades of community development experience had indeed been the most short-sighted decision they could possibly have made, ultimately transforming not just my living situation, but their family's understanding of what genuine community could contribute to their children's development and their own quality of life. 1 year after Winter Haven welcomed its first residents, we celebrated the anniversary with a community garden festival that symbolized how thoroughly the project had transformed both the physical space and social dynamics of lakeside estates. The once neglected Victorian property had blossomed into a vibrant hub where carefully tended gardens surrounded the beautifully restored main house, with meandering pathways connecting activity areas designed for participants of all ages and abilities. The celebration atmosphere reflected Winter Haven's success beyond even our most optimistic projections. Over 200 people filled the grounds, residents, neighbors, family members, and municipal officials drawn by the project's growing reputation as innovative model for integrated senior housing. Children darted between activity stations, supervised by residents sharing lifetime skills, from Professor Richardson's storytelling circle to Dr. Chen's butterfly identification workshop, where Emma proudly served as junior instructor, explaining monarch life cycles to fascinated younger children. "Your grandmother created something extraordinary here," I overheard Diana commenting to Emma as they arranged fresh-cut flowers for the celebration tables. "Something much more meaningful than what we had originally imagined for her." This simple acknowledgement, offered spontaneously rather than as calculated gesture, reflected the genuine perspective shift that had gradually developed through direct experience with Winter Haven's benefits rather than theoretical arguments about senior housing models. Diana's evolving view had progressed from initial rejection through reluctant tolerance to genuine appreciation, particularly as she witnessed her children's growth through intergenerational relationships that her carefully curated suburban lifestyle had previously eliminated. From my vantage point near the refreshment table where I greeted arriving guests, I could observe the full panorama of activity that illustrated Winter Haven's core philosophy. That meaningful community emerges through purposeful integration rather than age-segregated isolation. Retired teacher Margaret Johnson helped struggling readers in the outdoor learning nook, while former chef Thomas Williams supervised teenagers preparing brick oven pizzas in the outdoor kitchen. Former park ranger William Taylor led nature exploration along the property's wooded perimeter, where he had established bird habitat that attracted species previously absent from the manicured suburban landscape. Most striking was the natural integration that had developed between Winter Haven residents and surrounding community members. What had begun as deliberate programmatic offerings had evolved into genuine relationships based on mutual interest and reciprocal support. Children who initially attended structured activities now stopped by regularly to visit adopted grandparents, who offered both specialized knowledge and personal attention increasingly scarce in their achievement-focused schedules. Eleanor, the Community Development Committee wants to discuss expanding the Winter Haven model to other neighborhoods, announced City Councilwoman Patricia Reynolds, approaching with the professional purposefulness that characterized her reputation as the council's most effective policy innovator. The waiting list for residency here has grown to over 60 applicants, and several neighborhood associations have expressed interest in similar projects within their communities. This municipal interest, transforming Winter Haven from isolated experiment to potential policy model, represented significant evolution from the regulatory resistance we had initially encountered. Patricia had been among the skeptical officials when our permits first came before the Planning Commission, raising concerns about compatibility with existing residential character that echoed the Homeowners Association objections. Her current enthusiasm reflected both Winter Haven's demonstrated success and shifting political recognition of the growing need for innovative senior housing alternatives. We're preparing documentation of both the development process and operational model, I confirmed, having anticipated this interest as Winter Haven's community benefits became increasingly visible. Sophia has compiled comprehensive materials addressing zoning considerations, funding mechanisms, and community integration strategies based on our first-year experience. This knowledge sharing, extending Winter Haven's impact beyond our immediate community through policy replication, fulfilled the broader mission I had envisioned from the project's inception. While my initial motivation had admittedly included elements of personal vindication after James and Diana's rejection, the evolving purpose had expanded well beyond individual housing solution toward demonstrating viable alternative to the institutional senior living model that dominated current practice. As I continued greeting guests and addressing inevitable small logistical issues that emerged throughout the celebration, I noticed James engaged in serious conversation with Raymond near the property's entrance. Their discussion appeared focused on the structural elements Raymond was indicating along the roofline and porch columns, with James taking occasional notes on his phone as Raymond demonstrated specific restoration techniques. This technical exchange, focused on practical preservation methods rather than abstract aesthetic appreciation, suggested genuine interest beyond polite conversation, particularly given James's typically pragmatic focus on functionality rather than historical preservation. The evolution in James's relationship with Winter Haven had progressed through distinct phases over the past year. Initial resistance had given way to reluctant acceptance following our coffee shop conversation, gradually developing into practical involvement through the children's activities, and eventually emerging as genuine appreciation for specific aspects of the community model. While he remained naturally more reserved than his children in expressing enthusiasm, his increasing engagement with technical elements of the project suggested recognition of value beyond mere accommodation of unchangeable reality. "Mom, do you have a moment?" James asked, approaching as I finished arranging additional seating for the growing attendance. "There's something I'd like to discuss while everyone's occupied with activities." The serious tone suggested substantive conversation rather than casual check-in, prompting me to suggest the relative privacy of my apartment balcony overlooking the gardens while remaining visible to guests who might need assistance. As we settled into the comfortable seating area that had become my favorite morning reflection space, James seemed momentarily hesitant before addressing the purpose of his request. "I've been meeting with the Neighborhood Association Board regarding potential changes to our community infrastructure," he began, his expression suggesting this represented more significant development than routine homeowner business. "The pandemic and subsequent social changes have highlighted substantial limitations in our current development model, particularly the isolation created by prioritizing privacy over community connection. This acknowledgement that extreme privacy carried social costs their community had previously ignored represented meaningful evolution in perspective for someone who had specifically selected Lakeside Estates for its exclusivity and separation from broader community interaction. His willingness to critically examine previously unquestioned assumptions suggested genuine reassessment rather than superficial accommodation to changing circumstances. Raymond has been providing technical consultation about repurposing the central green space into something more functional than decorative landscaping, he continued, revealing unexpected connection to Winter Haven's design philosophy. "The current configuration has always been aesthetically pleasing, but fundamentally unused, essentially wasted space that could serve actual community needs if properly redesigned. This practical focus, transforming underutilized space into functional community resource, reflected core principles I had implemented throughout my urban planning career. particularly during neighborhood revitalization initiatives where identifying and repurposing underperforming public spaces had created significant community benefits with minimal infrastructure investment. James's recognition of this approach suggested either direct influence from Winterhaven's example or parallel conclusion, reached through independent observation. The association has approved preliminary exploration of creating a central gathering area with community garden space, children's natural playground, and covered pavilion for neighborhood events, he explained, showing concept sketches Raymond had apparently helped develop based on Winterhaven's most successful elements. We've been so focused on property values and aesthetic uniformity that we've completely neglected creating functional community spaces where meaningful interaction might naturally develop. This fundamental critique, acknowledging the development's prioritization of appearance over function, represented remarkable evolution from the rigid defense of existing standards that had characterized the Homeowners Association's initial response to Winterhaven. Their willingness to reconsider core assumptions about appropriate community design suggested Winterhaven's demonstrated benefits had influenced perspectives beyond immediate programming participants to include governance structures previously resistant to innovation. The board is interested in your perspective given your professional background and Winterhaven's obvious success, James continued, arriving at the specific request underlying our conversation. They've asked if you might be willing to consult on the community space redesign, bringing both your urban planning expertise and specific experience with intergenerational programming that's worked so effectively here. This invitation, seeking my professional contribution rather than merely tolerating my presence, represented complete reversal from the dismissive attitude that had characterized James and Diana's original approach to my capabilities and relevance. The acknowledgement of both theoretical expertise and practical implementation experience suggested genuine respect rather than strategic utilization of available resources, particularly given the association's previous resistance to anything connected with Winterhaven's development. I'd be happy to share relevant experience and principles, I responded after thoughtful consideration, particularly regarding design elements that naturally facilitate intergenerational interaction rather than imposing programmatic solutions on resistant infrastructure. This measured acceptance, offering expertise without overextending personal involvement, maintained appropriate boundaries while acknowledging potential value in collaborative approach to community development. Rather than emphasizing the irony in being consulted by organization that had initially attempted to block Winterhaven entirely, I focused on potential benefits of improved community infrastructure for all residents, including my own family members, still living within traditional development structure. Thank you, James replied with evident relief that suggested he had been uncertain about my response given our complicated history. The initial resistance to Winterhaven has completely reversed as people have experienced actual benefits rather than theoretical objections. Several board members who signed the original opposition letter now regularly participate in programs here. This transformation, from organized resistance to active engagement, reflected the community development principle I had emphasized throughout my professional career. That experiential exposure to well-designed alternatives typically proves more persuasive than theoretical arguments about potential benefits. By creating functioning demonstration model rather than abstract proposal, Winterhaven had provided tangible evidence that shifted perspectives more effectively than conceptual discussion could achieve. As our conversation concluded, and we returned to the anniversary celebration, Parker approached with Professor Chen, both wearing expressions of restrained excitement that suggested significant development requiring approval rather than simple social interaction. Grandmother, Professor Chen thinks I'm ready to help teach the beginning coding class for younger kids, Parker announced with mixture of pride and uncertainty that reflected genuine growth beyond achievement-focused confidence that had previously characterized his self-presentation. We've developed adapted curriculum for elementary students that uses game design to teach basic programming concepts. This development, transitioning from student to teaching assistant, represented meaningful maturation beyond the passive, consumption of enrichment activities that had characterized his previous educational experiences, the opportunity to contribute knowledge rather than simply acquire credentials aligned with Winter Haven's core philosophy of reciprocal value across generations, where everyone both provided and received benefits through community participation. Parker has shown remarkable aptitude for translating technical concepts into age-appropriate explanations, Professor Chen elaborated, his authentic appreciation evident in both tone and specific examples he provided. His patience with younger students demonstrates natural teaching ability that would benefit from structured development through actual classroom experience. This genuine mentor relationship, focused on developing Parker's capabilities through meaningful responsibility, rather than simply validating existing talents, illustrated Winter Haven's distinctive approach to intergenerational connection. Unlike conventional enrichment programs where adults delivered predetermined content to passive student recipients, our model emphasized collaborative learning where participants of all ages contributed according to their capabilities while developing new skills through structured support. We would supervise closely while providing graduated responsibility appropriate to his experience level, Professor Chen assured me, correctly anticipating potential concerns about excessive burden on a 12-year-old. The teaching assistant role is structured specifically to develop leadership skills while maintaining appropriate boundaries regarding primary responsibility. This thoughtful approach, balancing developmental opportunity with appropriate limitations, reflected the careful program design that distinguished Winter Haven's intergenerational activities from simplistic bringing generations together models that often failed to provide meaningful engagement for participants of all ages. By creating structured roles with clear expectations and supported growth opportunities, we established foundation for authentic contribution rather than symbolic participation. James's expression as he observed this exchange revealed complex emotions, pride in his son's accomplishment, appreciation for the developmental opportunity being offered, and perhaps recognition of the meaningful mentorship Parker had found through Winter Haven that transcended the achievement-focused enrichment activities they had previously prioritized. His thoughtful consideration before responding suggested genuine evaluation rather than automatic approval or rejection based on predetermined parenting philosophy. That sounds like an excellent opportunity if you're genuinely interested in the teaching aspect rather than just the technical content, he finally responded, addressing Parker directly with respect for his agency in the decision rather than imposing parental determination. The commitment would need to work around existing school responsibilities, but developing communication skills through teaching seems valuable regardless of your eventual career direction. This nuanced response, supporting the opportunity while establishing appropriate parameters, reflected evolution in James's parenting approach beyond the credential accumulation and achievement metrics that had previously dominated his educational priorities for the children. His acknowledgement of teaching's developmental value regardless of specific career relevance suggested broadening perspective on education's purpose beyond direct professional preparation toward holistic capability development. As the anniversary celebration continued around us, with community members of all ages engaged in activities spanning from artistic creation to nature exploration to technical skill development, I reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred since that painful moment when James had revealed there would be no room for me in the basement apartment they had promised but never intended to create. What had begun as personal housing crisis had evolved through strategic response into community resource that now benefited hundreds of people across multiple generations, while simultaneously catalyzing broader reconsideration of age-segregated living models that had previously dominated senior housing approaches. The rejection that might have relegated me to isolated institutional living had instead generated innovative alternative that demonstrated integration benefits for participants of all ages, creating ripple effects extending far beyond my individual situation. Most remarkably, the family relationships damaged by that initial rejection had gradually healed through practical collaboration rather than forced reconciliation, allowing new connection patterns to emerge based on mutual respect rather than obligatory association. While James would likely never fully acknowledge the depth of betrayal their basement apartment deception had represented, his evolved understanding of both my capabilities and their limitations had created foundation for authentic relationship that accommodated continuing differences while establishing genuine appreciation beyond superficial tolerance. 6 months after Winter Haven's first anniversary celebration, the project's influence expanded beyond our immediate community when the USI State Housing Authority selected our model for inclusion in their innovative senior living demonstration program. This designation provided both recognition and resources, additional funding for program development, technical assistance for knowledge sharing with other communities, and policy support for regulatory accommodations that would facilitate similar projects throughout the region. The selection committee was particularly impressed by your intergenerational programming outcomes, explained Catherine Martinez, the authority's director of innovative housing initiatives, during her site visit, to document Winter Haven's operational model. The measurable benefits for both senior residents and community participants provide compelling evidence for integrated approaches over traditional age-segregated facilities. This professional validation, recognizing Winter Haven's demonstrable outcomes rather than merely innovative concept, provided essential credibility for policy discussions about senior housing alternatives. The comprehensive documentation Catherine's team developed would inform funding priorities and regulatory frameworks throughout the state, potentially influencing hundreds of future senior housing developments beyond our single demonstration project. We're particularly interested in your community integration strategies, Catherine noted as we toured Winter Haven's various program spaces. Most innovative senior housing concepts still essentially create islands within existing neighborhoods, rather than genuine integration into community fabric. Your approach has clearly transcended that limitation. This observation, identifying Winter Haven's distinctive contribution to evolving practice, highlighted the aspect I considered most essential to the project's success. Where many alternative senior housing models focused exclusively on physical design innovations while maintaining fundamental separation between seniors and broader community, Winter Haven had deliberately dismantled those boundaries through infrastructure and programming specifically designed to facilitate natural interaction across conventional demographic divisions. The concrete impact of this approach became evident that afternoon when I encountered James in Winter Haven's community kitchen, collaborating with Raymond and several teenage neighbors to prepare food for the weekend farmers market that had developed as natural extension of our community garden program. Their comfortable interaction, focused on practical task rather than forced socializing, demonstrated how thoroughly Winter Haven had transformed from controversial intrusion to valued community resource. The neighborhood association approved the central gathering space design, James mentioned as we briefly discussed project developments. Construction begins next month, with several design elements directly adapted from Winter Haven's most successful features. The intergenerational approach has gained remarkable support, even from initially resistant homeowners. This community-wide evolution, from organized opposition to active replication, represented extraordinary transformation in local perspectives regarding both senior housing models and community design principles. The same association that had attempted to block Winter Haven through regulatory challenges now deliberately incorporated its core concepts into their own community infrastructure, acknowledging through actions rather than words the demonstrable benefits our integrated approach had provided.